Come closer so you can hear me well, my child. What I'm about to tell you is a story that's come from forgotten times, as ancient as the earth, whispering like the wind. Today we're stepping into the mist-covered past of Britain, into the world of Anglo-Saxon kings and monks. Once these lands echoed with the prayers of pagans, but then one man set out on a journey, a man whose journey would not only change his own fate, but the very soul of Britain. The year 597 AD. A news from beyond the continent of Europe was echoing in the halls of Anglo-Saxon kings. A missionary from Rome, sent directly by Pope Gregory, was dispatched to the northern part of Britain. His name was Augustine, and his mission was to plant a new faith in the land of the pagans. But this was no simple or easy task. Pagan gods had rooted themselves in these lands for thousands of years. The people were attached to their old rituals. For a new religion to take hold here, it would require more than just words or preaching. It would take blood, sweat, and patience. This story begins with one man's arrival in Britain, but before long, it evolves into the transformation of a whole nation. Pagan warriors, priests, kings, and monks, they were all part of this change. Would the old gods be forgotten, or would the new faith merge with the old traditions? Come, let's find out together. Get ready to dive deep into history, because this story is not just about religion, but about the rebirth of a nation's soul. Now listen closely, my friends. I'm going to take you back to ancient Britain, a land veiled in mist, where time itself hadn't fully shaped the world yet, and where the gods and idols were still intertwined. Back in those days, Britain was a place ruled by Anglo-Saxon kings, with skies forever gray, the seas always fierce, and forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. As people fought to protect their land, their gods, and their traditions, the echoes of Rome still lingered in the air. But a new age was about to begin, and one of the first sparks of that new age came from the eyes of Pope Gregory. Legend has it that one day while Pope Gregory was walking through the streets of Rome, he saw blue-eyed, fair-haired children in the slave market. When he asked who they were, they told him they were Angles. Pope Gregory took a deep breath and smiled. Such beautiful faces. I wish they were among the angels of heaven. And right there, Britain's fate began to change. A thought entered Gregory's mind: to bring Christianity to these lands, to lead those people into the light of God. And the person to carry out this sacred task was none other than Saint Augustine. Augustine was a Benedictine monk from Rome, quiet, obedient, but filled with deep faith. When he decided to set out on Pope Gregory's command, he must have had thousands of questions in his mind. He was heading to a land he'd never been to before, a place full of uncertainty. Would it be the harsh climate of Britain, or the wrath of the Anglo-Saxon kings that awaited him? He set off with a group of monks. The journey was long, the seas rough. As they sailed through the raging waves of the North Sea, do you think there was a fear in his heart? Who knows? But we do know one thing: despite that fear, he didn't stray from his path. Finally, when he set foot on Britain's eastern shores, he was faced with a foreign world. Wooden longhouses rising under a gray sky, oak forests hidden in the mist, and Anglo-Saxons who looked at him with suspicion. When he arrived, his first stop was Canterbury. At the time, King Ethelbert sat on the throne of the Kingdom of Kent. He was a tough and warrior-like king, but interestingly, he was also known to be merciful to foreigners. Plus, he was married to Princess Bertha of the Franks, who was Christian. This could have made Augustine's task easier, but he still had to be cautious. King Ethelbert received the foreign man and his monks in a meadow. Augustine and his companions, carrying crosses and singing hymns, slowly walked toward the king. This was a scene never before seen in Britain. The king tilted his head slightly and listened to their words. Augustine spoke to him about God's love, the salvation of the soul, and the virtues of the Christian faith. But Ethelbert was a king, and he wasn't going to bow down immediately. There was a long silence. Finally, the king spoke. "What you say about your God is nice, but I will not immediately abandon the faith of my people." However, he did offer a favor. He gave Augustine and his monks permission to live in Canterbury and spread their teachings. And so, the first sparks of Christianity began to shine in Britain, right there in Canterbury. Augustine established a monastery and began preaching. Little by little, people started to listen to him, and some began to show interest in this new faith. But this journey was far from over. What about King Aethelbert? Would he accept Christianity? And would the people of Britain turn away from their old gods and embrace a new faith? Well, my friends, these answers will come in the next chapter of our story. Now, close your eyes and listen closely, my friends. The story I'm about to tell isn't just about a king, but about moments that changed the fate of a people, and maybe even an entire era. We're going back to the old days of Britain, where the mists still lingered and pagan gods whispered in the shadows. I'll tell you how King Aethelbert and his big decision changed the lands of Britain. King Aethelbert. He was the powerful ruler of the Kingdom of Kent. Known for his fierce temper, fair rule, and victories on the battlefield, he was not just a king but a leader whom the gods seemed to favor. He had ruled for many years, expanding his lands and growing into a formidable power in Anglo-Saxon territory. But every great ruler has a moment in their life that turns them from a king into a legend. And for Aethelbert, that legend began the moment a monk named Augustine set foot in his land. Augustine and his fellow monks had settled in Canterbury and, with King Aethelbert's permission, had begun preaching. But changing a people's beliefs is not as easy as swinging a sword on the battlefield, my friends. The Anglo-Saxons were devoted to their old gods, Woden, Thunor, Tiwar. These gods had been passed down through generations, and the spirits of the sky and earth were believed to be tied to them. Augustine, however, waited patiently with faith. He and his followers kept preaching, mingling with the people, speaking their language, entering their world. But then, one day, something stirred in King Aethelbert's palace. The king hadn't spoken to Augustine for some time, keeping his distance, but he was also curious about this foreign faith. And that day, Aethelbert sent messengers to summon Augustine to his court. Do you know how carefully a king thinks when making a decision? That's how Aethelbert was on that day. His eyes carried the weight of years of rule, and thoughts were clashing in his mind. When Augustine arrived at the court, the king looked at him and said, "You've been teaching in my lands for some time, and my people are listening to you. Some are curious about your faith. Tell me, what will this new belief bring to my kingdom?" The answer to this question would shape the future of Britain. Augustine, without hesitation, replied, "This faith will not only elevate your soul, but also exalt your kingdom, bringing peace and order. When the love of God and the power of kings combine, the lands will prosper and the people will thrive." And maybe this was the most crucial moment. A thought crossed Aethelbert's mind. Like the great kings before him, he admired the splendor of Rome. And Rome's power had been intertwined with Christianity. If he wanted to follow in Rome's footsteps, perhaps this new faith could be an opportunity for his kingdom. But he didn't rush into a decision. Days passed, weeks passed. Finally, on an Easter morning, King Aethelbert decided to be baptized at St. Martin's Church in Canterbury. That moment marked the dawn of a new era over the lands of Britain. It was the moment the thrones of the old gods shook, and a new faith began to take root. And so Christianity went from being a personal belief in the Kingdom of Kent to becoming the faith of the court, the government, and the people. Churches were built, monasteries were founded, and Augustine and his monks grew in power. Christianity began to spread across the kingdom. But, my friends, just because a king changes his faith doesn't mean the faith of his people will change overnight. Pagan traditions, ancestral rituals, the shadows of the old gods still lingered in these lands. So how would Christianity truly take root here? And how would the Anglo-Saxon people come into conflict with their old beliefs. Ah, my friends, that's the subject of our next story. Ah, friends, listen closely to what I'm about to tell you, because what I'm going to share is not just the story of a faith, but a transformation that shaped the destiny of an entire people. King Ethelbert had been baptized, and Christianity had officially come under the protection of the king in Kent. But simply changing a king's faith wasn't enough. Faith only shows its true power when it takes root not just in a person's heart, but in the soul of the people, when it's carved into stone walls and becomes a legacy that lasts for centuries. And that's how it all began in Canterbury, those stone walls. That's where Augustine, or St. Augustine's great legacy started. Canterbury was once a royal center, but for it to become a spiritual one, more was needed. When Augustine first arrived on these lands, he found a people tightly bound to their pagan traditions. Their beliefs were shaped around the earth, the wind, the lightning, and the spirits of their ancestors. But that was changing now. With the support of King Ethelbert, Augustine's message had become more than just the words of a foreigner. It had turned into a power that would shape the future of the kingdom, and that power would have its heart in Canterbury. First, Augustine had a church built on the land he was given. Oh, my friends, this wasn't just a simple building. It wasn't just made of stone, wood, and a roof. No, this was the foundation of a new world, challenging the gods of the old one. St. Martin's Church, a building dating back to the Roman era, was where the first baptisms took place. But Augustine's dreams were much bigger. For him, Canterbury wasn't just the spiritual center of Kent, but of all of Britain. And that's how the foundations for the archbishopric were laid. Why Canterbury, you ask? Because it wasn't just the closest place to the king, but also a place of great historical and strategic significance. Augustine didn't want to sever ties with Rome. In the eyes of Pope Gregory, Augustine wasn't just a missionary, but also the representative of the Roman Church in Britain. If Christianity was to truly thrive here, it had to have a center, and Canterbury was it. Augustine's leadership wasn't just about preaching. He was also working to build structures that would make this new faith permanent. The foundations for Canterbury Cathedral were laid. This magnificent structure would one day become one of the most important religious centers in Britain. If only you knew how grand the services in that cathedral would become. But back then, they were only just beginning to build. Monks were carefully placing stones, new monasteries were being built, religious schools were opening, and priests were being trained. Christianity was beginning to shift from being a faith of individuals to a faith of an entire community. But remember, my friends, changing a people's beliefs isn't just about building stone buildings. The Anglo-Saxon people, who had been offering sacrifices to idols for centuries, praying to their old gods under the moonlight, how would they accept this new faith? Would there be a conflict between pagan traditions and Christianity? My friends, these are the questions you'll get answers to in the next story, because Britain's faith was still about to face a trial. Friends, now listen carefully, because the story I'm about to tell you is not just about a faith, but how the spirit of a whole people changed. Remember, the foundations were laid in Canterbury. King Ethelbert had embraced Christianity, and St. Augustine's teachings had begun to spread among the people of Kent. But Britain wasn't just about Kent. But to the north were the lands shaped by fierce winds, to the east were coastal cities ruled by sailors, and to the west were communities living behind high mountains. Each had their own kings, their own traditions, and they all faced the same question. Would they accept this new faith, or stay true to their old gods? Christianity didn't spread easily across Anglo-Saxon lands. Even though Ethelbert's decision had been a major turning point, it would take time, patience, and brave missionaries to get other kings to follow the same path. In the north, the powerful kingdom of Northumbria was ruled by King Edwin, who was initially skeptical of Christianity. In his world, the gods existed in thunder, on the battlefield, and in the clash of swords. But life as we know isn't just about war and conquest, right? Every king wants to secure the future of their throne and their lineage. And that's what changed Edwin's fate. This new faith wasn't just a belief, it also promised order, alliance, and stability. Legend has it that Edwin's wife Ethelberg was a Christian and made great efforts to persuade her husband to follow the same path. But was that enough for a king to change his faith? No, my friends, more was needed. And that's when a missionary named Paulinus stepped into the picture. Paulinus was known for his wisdom and patience. When he stood before Edwin and boldly spoke of the existence of a single God, the king listened quietly, but he was unsure. In his world, his ancestors' beliefs were strong. The old gods had brought victory and prosperity for centuries. What if believing in this new God would anger them? The legends say that one of the king's advisors spoke up. "My lord, I remember a time when we sat in a hall. Outside it was pitch black and a storm was raging. Then a small sparrow flew into the light and warmth of the hall, and then flew out the other window, disappearing into the darkness. We are like that sparrow. Life is like a brief light shining, with the before and after unknown. Perhaps this new faith will show us what lies beyond the darkness." These words softened Edwin's heart, and so Edwin became Christian. The lands of Northumbria were baptized, and Paulinus' teachings spread. But Edwin's fate was tragic. Just a few years after accepting his faith, he would be killed in battle, and the spread of Christianity would be halted for a time. But my friends, once the seed of faith is planted, even the strongest winds cannot completely destroy it. After Edwin's death, the people of Northumbria didn't forget this new faith. His successor, Oswald, strengthened Christianity even further, founding the Lindisfarne Monastery and embedding the faith deep into the kingdom. Meanwhile, to the south, kingdoms like Wessex and Mercia were still devoted to their old gods. But my friends, nothing in history ever stays the same. Just as King Edwin's baptism opened a path, in the years that followed, more kings and people would accept Christianity one by one. But this process was far from easy. So, how did the old gods put up their last resistance? How did those who clung to pagan beliefs react to this new religion? My friends, the real struggle was only just beginning. My friends, close your eyes and imagine. A land where the wind whispers the ancient names of the gods beneath the shade of the forests, and feast fires are dedicated to the gods. In Anglo-Saxon Britain, the old gods still ruled. Odin, Thor, Freyr. Warriors shouted their names as they raised their swords, and farmers prayed to them for blessings. Behind the lightning that lit up the sky was Thor's rage, and beneath the waves crashing in the seas was Njord's will. But then, a new belief arrived from distant lands. It spoke of one God. It said that everything created was bound by his will. Could the people so easily turn away from the path of their ancestors? Of course not, because belief is not like a stone that can be uprooted and cast aside. It is like a tree deeply rooted in the soil. This is why the arrival of Christianity meant not just the acceptance of a new religion, but the upheaval of the old world. For the old pagan priests, this change was a difficult blow to accept. They had been advisors to kings and guides for the people for centuries. They managed rituals, offered sacrifices, and interpreted the gods' messages. Now the teachings of Augustine and other missionaries were threatening their authority. At first, Christianity seemed like it was only a belief held by kings and a few nobles. The priests thought they could use the old ties in the hearts of the people to resist this new religion. The old temples still stood, and sacrifices were still being offered at altars hidden deep in the forests. The greatest resistance to the new faith came in the northern kingdoms, like Mercia and East Anglia, where pagan traditions were still firmly held. According to legends, a powerful pagan priest from Mercia came before King Penda and said, "Don't let them deceive us, my lord. The gods of our ancestors protected us and blessed our lands. Now, should we abandon them and bow to this new foreign god?" Penda was a wise man. He knew that the old beliefs were still strong among the people. So for a time, he resisted the Christians, even going to war against them. But over time, victory is not just achieved by the power of swords, but by the transformation of hearts. Christian priests weren't fighting with swords. They were transforming people with words and beliefs. This new belief wasn't just about accepting a different God. New rituals, new prayers, new holy places began to be a part of life. The sacred forest rituals were replaced by prayers in stone churches. Bloody sacrifices were forbidden, and in their place came prayers, communal worship, and ceremonies. Christianity didn't root out the old beliefs entirely, but transformed them, incorporating some of their aspects. Perhaps that's why some of the old festivals continue to be celebrated with new meanings. The Yule festival became Christmas, and the Beltane fires blended into the light of Easter. But my friends, remember that every transformation is painful. The struggle between the old and the new is a story written not just with swords, but with words, beliefs, and sometimes with blood. But this struggle wasn't over yet. So how did Christianity finally triumph in the Anglo-Saxon world? And how did this new faith change the everyday lives of the people? Well, my friends, the next chapter of our story will answer these very questions. My friends, close your eyes and imagine this. A place rising from the northern mists, blessed by the sounds of the waves and shaped by prayers. This is a land where not only the stones, but even the wind is filled with holiness. Back when the Saxon lands began to embrace Christianity, an island monastery rose up to carry its light through dark times. Lindisfarne. A long time ago, in the north of Britain, the kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira united to form the powerful Northumbria. King Oswald, ruler of this new kingdom, wanted to rule not just with the sharpness of his sword, but with the strength of his faith. Oswald had spent his youth in exile on the island of Iona, where he learned Christianity from the Celtic monks. When he returned to his throne, he saw his faith as not only a personal peace, but also a force to unite his kingdom. However, his people were still living with their old gods, breathing in their ancient beliefs. Oswald knew that in order to bring Christianity to his lands, a strong spiritual center needed to be built. And so he turned his eyes north to find a sacred place, Lindisfarne Island. Lindisfarne was connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway shaped by the tides, a place that seemed created by nature itself for solitude and sanctity. This place hadn't been tainted by the chaos of crowded cities or the bloodshed of battlefields. The waves gently crashed against the rocks here. The wind carried prayers, and the sky seemed to owe its clarity solely to God's mercy. Oswald requested a monk from the Iona monastery to come and establish a center of Christianity here. So it was here that a monk named Aidan arrived to lay the foundations of the monastery. Aidan would go on to become one of England's most significant religious figures. Aidan wasn't just a monk, he was a teacher, a spiritual leader, and truly a warrior of faith. When he arrived at Lindisfarne, there wasn't yet a large stone-built monastery. He and the other monks started by building wooden huts and a small church. As the monastery grew, it became more than just a place for praying monks to live. Lindisfarne became a center of education and culture. Young monks here learned sacred texts, created manuscripts, and laid the foundations for a Christian generation that would spread across Saxon lands. Don't forget, my friends, that monasteries weren't just places of worship back then. They were places of knowledge, writing, and the development of art. The manuscripts produced in Lindisfarne, which still awe people today, are the legacy of those times. As King Oswald supported the growth of this monastery, Lindisfarne's influence spread beyond Northumbria. The monks trained here began to spread both north and south. Christianity was no longer just a religion for kings and nobles. It was taking root among the people. Even in areas where pagan beliefs were still strong, the words and compassion of the monks from Lindisfarne were transforming hearts. And so this small island slowly became one of the most important religious centers in Britain. But my friends, every great light has a shadow. So, did the glory of Lindisfarne last forever? Or did a dark storm one day approach the island, changing everything? Wait and listen, because this story has more to tell. Ah, my friends, close your eyes and join me as we step through the fog of time. We're heading to a land where the waves crash against the shore, and the wind carries the prayers soaked in sea salt. This is the wild and captivating land of northern Britain, and here a faith shaped by the holy light from Ireland was about to reach the hearts of the Anglo-Saxons. At the center of this transformation stood an island rising from the ocean, Iona. Iona wasn't just any place, hidden away from the world, a refuge from storms and winds. This island wasn't just a test of nature, it was a test of faith too. In the mid-6th century, Saint Columba and his companions from Ireland established a monastery here. But their goal wasn't just to pray and retreat from the world. No, they wanted to spread the word of God across Britain, to be a light for people trapped in the darkness of the times. Columba and his followers saw themselves not just as monks, but as missionaries. The island of Iona became a place where writings, prayers, and an unwavering faith took root. Over time, this little island would become one of the most important religious centers in Britain. Here, monks weren't just praying, they were copying scriptures, educating youth, and preparing for a future that would open new doors. But my friends, for a faith to be truly strong, prayers alone aren't enough. You also need a ruler who will carry it forward, guiding the people. Enter King Oswald. Oswald had lost his throne at a young age and was sent into exile by his enemies. His escape led him to the lush shores of Ireland, and here he found refuge at the Iona Monastery. As a young boy, Oswald had seen the harsh side of life, facing the brutal realities of political games. But fate at times strengthens a person at their weakest moments, doesn't it? During his years at Iona, Oswald wasn't just raised as a prince, he was raised as a Christian. The teachings of the Irish monks left a deep mark on his soul. Christianity became more than a religion to him, it became a path to salvation. Years later, fate called him back to British soil. When he gathered his army to reclaim Northumbria, he wasn't just relying on his sword, he was relying on his faith. It's said that just before the great battle, he prayed with his soldiers, asking God for victory. And then, that great battle. In 633, when King Edwin died at Hatfield Chase, Northumbria was thrown into chaos. But a few years later, Oswald returned to the north, victorious, and re-established his kingdom. He was no longer just a warrior king. He was a leader who wanted to spread the light of his faith across his lands. He wanted Christianity to take root in Northumbria. But how would he make that happen? Oswald didn't forget his old friends. When he became king, he sent word to the monks of Iona, asking them to send a missionary to strengthen Christianity in Northumbria. The first monk who came failed in the face of the people's tough nature and the strength of Anglo-Saxon traditions. But Oswald was a man who didn't give up. He sent word to Iona again, and this time the right person came, Saint Aidan. Aidan settled on Lindisfarne Island, where he built a monastery, and he had the full support of Oswald. The king saw Aidan not just as a priest, but as a guide. So much so that Oswald, eager for the people to understand him, would sometimes personally translate Aidan's words. Together, these two men, one a warrior of the sword, the other a warrior of faith, began to transform Northumbria. The people, once devoted to the old gods, began to slowly accept this new faith. But my friends, every great transformation comes with its conflicts. The struggle between pagan beliefs and Christianity was still ongoing. So the question remains, could Christianity truly take root in Northumbria? Or would this new faith be swept away by the harsh winds of opposition? Well, my friends, the story doesn't end here. Get ready to hear more. Ah, my friends, let me take you back through the mists of time to those days of great debate. Imagine a monastery rising on the rocky shores of Northumbria, surrounded by the sea. This is Whitby, a place that's both a spiritual refuge and a center where deep thoughts and decisions are born. But Whitby isn't just a peaceful place where monks pray. No, there's a big decision to be made here. And this decision will affect not just the monks, but all of Britain. This is where the story of the Synod of Whitby begins. At that time, Christianity had already taken root in Britain, but even though it seemed like one unified faith, there was actually a huge divide between two different traditions. On one side, there was Celtic Christianity, born from the emerald shores of Ireland, shaped by the teachings of St. Columba and the monks from Iona. It had its own unique way of worship, following nature's rhythms and blending old traditions. And Celtic monks built their monasteries in remote places, leading simple, solitary lives. For them, finding God meant being in the embrace of nature, hearing the wind, feeling the rhythm of the waves. They used their own calendar, celebrated Easter on different dates, and even cut their hair differently from the Roman priests. On the other side, there was Roman Christianity, disciplined, organized, centralized. This tradition claimed to carry the legacy of St. Peter and accepted the authority of the Pope, aiming to unify all under one roof. For them, church unity required harmony in worship and religious practices. And the Celtic traditions in Britain seemed a little too disorganized and independent for Rome's taste. Over time, these differences became a growing problem. The effects of this divide were felt even in the court of King Oswiu of Northumbria. Oswiu had been raised in the Celtic tradition, but his wife, Queen Enfled, followed the Roman way. In fact, sometimes one person in the palace would celebrate Easter while another was still fasting. Imagine that. People in the same household believing in the same God, but worshiping on different days. This wasn't just a family matter. It had become a problem for the entire kingdom. A decision had to be made, and that's why the Synod of Whitby was called. In 664 AD, at Whitby Abbey, religious leaders and scholars gathered under the king's leadership. The purpose of the synod was to decide which path Christianity in Britain should follow: the independent, nature-connected Celtic faith, or the disciplined, united Roman way. Representing the Celtic side was St. Colman, the Bishop of Lindisfarne. He was accompanied by monks from Iona and others who supported the old traditions. For them, the Celtic way was the legacy of the saints and ancestors in Ireland. To submit to Rome's authority would be a betrayal of that sacred heritage. Leading the Roman side was Saint Wilfrid, Archbishop of Canterbury. Wilfrid was a persuasive speaker, and he emphasized the strength of the Roman tradition and the importance of the Pope's authority. He argued that Easter had to be celebrated on the same day, or Christianity's unity would be broken. His strongest argument was the authority of St. Peter. St. Peter holds the keys to heaven, he said, and Rome is his successor. If you reject Rome's way, you reject St. Peter. The synod went on for days. Arguments flew and both sides defended their beliefs and traditions. King Oswiu listened carefully, observing the debates and trying to understand both sides. And finally, when it came time for him to make a decision, everyone held their breath. The king declared that he supported the Roman side. He believed in St. Peter's authority and thought the church needed to be united. This decision was a turning point for Christianity in Britain. From that moment on, the Roman way was adopted, and the Celtic tradition faded into the background. St. Colman and the Celtic monks were deeply disappointed. They left Lindisfarne and returned to Ireland to preserve their faith. But the Celtic tradition didn't disappear completely. Their spirit, prayers, and teachings continued to echo through Britain's churches. But now, Britain was united with Rome, accepting the Pope's authority. But my friends, was the Synod of Whitby just a religious debate? Or was this decision a political move that would shape the future of Britain? To understand that, we need to dig deeper. My friends. Now let me take you through the depths of wisdom, knowledge, and spirituality that flow through time. If you think history is all about wars, power struggles, and great kings, you're mistaken. Because one of humanity's quiet but most powerful revolutions didn't happen through the gleam of swords, but through the magic of ink and parchment. This revolution took shape within the walls of monasteries. Hungry minds were nurtured here. and words were woven together with care. In those ancient days, along Britain's cobbled roads, there were monasteries rising through the mist. These sacred buildings weren't just places of worship. They were also sanctuaries for knowledge and education. Beyond the chaos and wars of the great cities, monks lived a completely different life, one of silence, prayer, and devotion to learning. These monasteries became beacons of education, even during Europe's darkest times, lighting the way for future generations with the knowledge of the past. So, what was a monk's day like, you ask? Well, they would wake with the first light of dawn, pray, and then the most sacred task of the day would begin, writing and learning. In large halls, manuscripts spread across long wooden tables, carefully worked parchment, and lines of text that tired the eyes but nourished the soul. With quills in hand, monks would carefully form letters, copying Latin texts and striving to perfectly reproduce sacred writings. The scent of ink mixed with the flickering light of beeswax candles, and the knowledge of centuries past became immortal within those stone walls. Monastic schools weren't just for monks. They were centers of learning for students from the outside world as well. Here, they taught reading and writing, mathematics, astronomy, and even medical knowledge. Many of them, blending ancient wisdom from pagan times with Roman and Greek thought, created an intellectual heritage far ahead of their time. Centers like Lindisfarne, Iona, Canterbury, and York welcomed students from all over Europe. And of course, the books. Oh, the books! They were the greatest treasure of these monasteries. Libraries were the deepest wells of wisdom. Copying a book back then could take months, even years. That's why every manuscript held immeasurable value. Monks not only wrote, but created art with the pages they decorated, illuminated initials with gold leaf, intricate patterns on the borders, tiny figures hidden within the text. When all came together, it was more than just a book. It was a work of art. Without these manuscripts, many ancient pieces of knowledge and works of literature might not have made it to us today. Homer's epics, Plato's philosophy, Augustine's teachings, all of these were passed down through the hands of those silent, patient monks. Instead of being lost in the chaos of their time, those books were preserved within the stone walls of the monasteries, passed down from generation to generation. My friends, as powerful as knowledge may be, there have always been dark forces that threaten it. So what was the great danger that threatened these sacred books and monasteries? Well, to learn that, we need to dig a little deeper. My friends. Now let me take you to a time when the shadows of the past began to lift and knowledge and stories illuminated the world. It was an age when a fading past was carefully written down, immortalized on paper. And among the greatest masters of this craft was a wise man whose name would transcend centuries and still echo today, Saint Bede. His pen was sharper than the swords of warriors and more powerful than the words of kings. It's because he didn't just write about what he saw, he carefully recorded everything that had happened, the story of his people, the history of his nation. Saint Bede was born in 673 AD in Northumbria, under the shadows of the Wearmouth and Jarrow monasteries. Back then, monasteries weren't just places of prayer, they were also fortresses of knowledge and learning. Bede entered these monasteries at a young age and devoted himself fully to studying, writing, and teaching. He wasn't just a monk, he was also a historian, but not just any historian. He was a sage who observed, researched, traced the footprints of the past, and passed them on to the future. Among his works, the most famous, and perhaps the greatest source on Anglo-Saxon history, is Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, or The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. This book wasn't just a religious history, it was a unique source that told the story of who the Anglo-Saxons were, where they came from, and how they built their civilization. Saint Bede meticulously wrote about the reigns of kings, the rise of monasteries, the development of the church, and how his people were converted to Christianity. But perhaps the most impressive part wasn't just the events themselves. It was how he wove the reasons behind those events. the beliefs, hopes, and fears of the people into the very fabric of his narrative. So how did St. Bede gather all this information? Writing history back then wasn't as easy as it is today. Resources were limited, documents were rare, and most of what was written had either been lost or passed down only through oral traditions. That's why Bede didn't just study the texts in the monastery libraries. He spoke to the elder scholars of his time, sent messenger monks to collect old manuscripts, and carefully recorded the testimonies of those who had lived through the events. So he wasn't just a writer, he was almost like a detective, tracing the footprints of the past. But St. Bede's contributions didn't stop with this one work. His efforts also inspired the systematic recording of Anglo-Saxon chronicles. These chronicles are among the most important documents in English history. They record the reigns of kings, wars, natural events, the founding of monasteries, and the changes in society. Thanks to these records, much of England's history has survived. Under Bede's leadership, writing history became a tradition in Anglo-Saxon culture, and his meticulous methods guided later historians. But my friends, St. Bede's works didn't just preserve knowledge, they also helped shape a nation's sense of identity. In his writings, the origins, beliefs, and past of the Anglo-Saxon people came to life. And perhaps most importantly, these records allowed the people to better understand themselves and learn from their past. But how did the legacy of this great scholar reach us today? What challenges did his works face? What dangers did they overcome? To truly understand, we need to dig a little deeper. My friends, today I'm taking you on a journey through a massive transformation in Anglo-Saxon lands. One that didn't just change people's beliefs, but also their laws and social order. A change so powerful it was sharper than swords and more impactful than wars. Because the fate of nations isn't decided by armies and kings alone. Sometimes words, beliefs, and written laws shape the future of an entire people, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were no exception. Their old legal traditions, rooted in pagan customs, slowly gave way to a legal system shaped by Christianity. But how did this happen? Well, that's exactly what I'm about to tell you. In the beginning, Anglo-Saxon law was based on the traditions of nomadic warrior tribes. Every tribe had its own set of rules, and justice was often carried out through blood feuds. If a man killed someone from another family, the victim's relatives would seek revenge, and this cycle could go on for generations. But over time, especially with the spread of Christianity, this brutal system started to be replaced with something more just and peaceful. The church became a major force in shaping both the moral and legal foundations of society. Anglo-Saxon kings didn't just want their people to be warriors, they also wanted them to be obedient followers of God's order. And that's where the church's influence on law really started to take hold. Monks and priests weren't just praying, they were reading, writing, and recording laws. The legal system was no longer just about settling disputes, it was about aligning society with divine justice. Crimes weren't just offenses against individuals anymore, they were seen as sins against God's order. One of the biggest steps in this transformation was taken by King Aethelbert of Kent. He was the first Anglo-Saxon king to establish written laws in Britain, and his laws were heavily influenced by Christian teachings. These new rules helped replace the culture of vengeance with a system of monetary compensation. For example, if someone damaged another person's property, they could pay a fine instead of facing violent retaliation. The church fully supported this system, urging kings to align their laws with the concept of divine justice. But Christianity's influence on law didn't stop at punishments. It reshaped society itself. The church established marriage laws, strengthening the institution of family while banning adultery and polygamy. Slavery, which had once been a normal part of life, began to decline under the church's pressure. Oaths and promises were no longer just agreements between people. They became sacred vows made before God. But my friends, this change didn't happen without resistance. Many Anglo-Saxon tribes held tightly to their traditions, and not everyone welcomed the new order. Some noblemen saw the growing power of the church as a threat. So, how did rulers and religious leaders maintain this delicate balance? And how did the relationship between Christianity and the state evolve in the years that followed? Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Ah, my friends. Today, I'm taking you to a world of towering stone churches, grand halls echoing with prayers, and beams of light illuminating the souls within. In Anglo-Saxon England, Christianity wasn't just taking root in people's hearts, it was being carved into stone walls. Deep in the forests and along the rivers, old pagan temples were either torn down or transformed. Altars once dedicated to pagan gods were replaced with images of saints, and hymns filled the valleys where battle cries once rang out. At first, churches were simple wooden structures. Anglo-Saxon craftsmen built sacred halls from sturdy oak, where candlelit services were held, and prayers were whispered to God. But over time, with the influence of Rome, stonework became more sophisticated. The ruins of the Roman Empire provided a foundation, both literally and symbolically, for the new faith. Old Roman stones were repurposed to build the walls of new churches, creating a bridge between past and future. In York, Canterbury, and London, these sacred buildings weren't just places of worship. They became centers for education, governance, and community. One of the strongest supporters of this transformation was Queen Ethelberga. She wasn't just a king's wife. She was a key figure in spreading Christianity within the royal family. As a woman, she held a special place not just in the palace, but also in the hearts of the people. She donated from the royal treasury to fund the construction of churches, encouraged the establishment of monasteries, and helped create religious schools where young girls could receive an education. Thanks to her efforts, women began taking on important roles within the church. Nuns were no longer just devoted to prayer. They became scholars, legal advisors, and influential leaders in their communities. But Christianity's rise also shook the balance of power within the royal court. Some of the old noble families felt that the new order was becoming too dominant and worried that their pagan traditions would be completely erased. So, how would the delicate balance between the church and the monarchy be maintained? Would kings continue to submit to divine authority, or would they push back to protect their own power? Well, my friends, that's where things start to get really interesting. Ah, my friends, today I'm taking you on a journey through the ever-changing world of the Anglo-Saxons, a land once ruled by independent kingdoms, warring clans, and nomadic warriors. Even though they shared a common language, similar traditions, and the same ancestral roots, the people of these lands didn't see themselves as part of a single nation. Instead, they identified with their own kingdoms. But over time, as church towers rose toward the sky and prayers echoed through stone cathedrals, it wasn't just faith that was transforming, it was the very soul of the Anglo-Saxon people. Christianity didn't just introduce a new religion, it brought a whole new way of thinking. In the old pagan beliefs, each tribe lived under the protection of its own gods, attributing victories and misfortunes to their divine favor or wrath. But the idea of a single God united people under a common faith. Anglo-Saxons no longer saw themselves as just the people of Mercia, Northumbria, or Wessex. They also saw themselves as part of the Christian world, and over time, this shift laid the foundation for a new social order and a shared identity. With the rise of the church came the spread of literacy and education. Stories that had once been passed down through oral tradition were carefully recorded by monks and scribes, preserving them for future generations. Scholars like the Venerable Bede documented the history of these lands. Sacred texts were translated from Latin into the Anglo-Saxon language, and as people began learning about their past through written records, a sense of collective awareness began to form. Monasteries weren't just places of worship, they became centers of knowledge and culture. The monks trained their advised kings, educated the people, and played a key role in shaping the future. Of course, the old ways didn't disappear overnight. Pagan festivals were transformed into Christian celebrations. Ancient symbols were reinterpreted within the new faith. Traditional festivals became saints' feast days, and those who once made offerings under sacred oak trees now lit candles at church altars. The Anglo-Saxon identity became a fusion of old and new, creating a uniquely blended form of faith. But would this new order last forever? As the church gained power, the relationship between kings and religious leaders became more complicated. So, how would the rise of the church shape the future of these lands? Well, my friends, that question leads us into a whole new chapter of history.